Hello everyone, welcome back to our self-care series. This video will be the last video for the term, and as it's kind of our last video this term, I wanted to talk about something that's a little bit more serious, and particularly as we're coming up to Christmas and the holiday season, I thought it'd be important to talk about this, particularly in terms of self-care. So from one person who has experienced it to another, let's talk about grief. So, grief. It's not great to have to go through it. It kind of sucks. It's not easy. But grief is something that we all as humans have to go through. It's, one of those universal human experiences, and most of us will go through it multiple times, not just the once in our life. And right now we're all kind of collectively going through this experience of like this massive period and this prolonged period of loss and grief through the pandemic here. But usually it's not a pandemic that's causing grief. The most common cause would be a loss, whether that's maybe the loss of someone through a death, or maybe the breaking of a relationship or a friendship. But it can be caused by different things. Grief can come as a reaction to major changes in our life, things like moving away for the first time or moving on our own for the first time. That break from what is familiar, what is comfortable, what is our support system, our normal support system, what is routine, can cause a grief reaction. Things like disappointments can also cause a grief reaction. Maybe it's, I didn't do so well on that paper or on that exam, and so all of a sudden your body kind of goes through that grief state. And like I said, we're all experiencing grief through this pandemic. It's the pandemic is sort of moved us into this period of isolation and distancing, and that has come with the loss of a lot of things like special events, celebrations, milestones in people's lives, traditions, and also the distancing of relationships. Even though the relationship isn't broken, even just having that separation and that distance can cause that grief reaction. And one thing to keep in mind, even though we talk about grief as a universal human experience, there's no universal way to get through grief. We all go through it in our own way and at our own pace too. So something that works for me, or the way that I grieve, may not be the same for somebody else, and it may take me longer than somebody else to grieve, even though we're in a similar or the same situation. So one way of breaking down grief is to kind of talk about it in those 5 sort of classic stages of grief. Those are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So denial is that feeling of being sort of shocked, or it's a feeling of disbelief, or maybe a numbness, feeling like we're in a bubble, or like we're kind of drifting almost. It's that this can't be happening kind of a reaction, or I can't believe that this has happened kind of a thing, which really is a defense, because grief comes often with a tidal wave of emotion, and in particular pain. And so that denial is one way for us to kind of deal with all of those emotions. Instead of kind of being hit and overwhelmed by the wave, we have a chance to maybe temper it just a little bit. So anger, when the pain kind of starts to come through, and questions like, why did this happen, or how could this happen, when those start to kind of circulate in our brains, and questions, these questions don't really have an answer, and that can lead to frustration or feeling helpless. And in reaction to those questions and these feelings of frustration, that's when we can start to feel angry. And that anger could be directed at someone, it could be directed at God, it could be directed at, maybe if we lost someone, it could be directed at the person that we lost, or even just life in general. And it could kind of manifest itself in a way where maybe our anger is simply more easily triggered. You know, we're a little bit, we're easier to make angry, and it's easier for us to stay angry during that time. In bargaining, that's where we have, we start to kind of think about our own involvement in the situation, and it's questions of maybe guilt start to come forward and come out in that pain of the loss. Questions like, well, if only I had, or what if I had done this, or I should have done whatever it is. Or maybe we try to just go straight to God and strike a bargain with God, something like, please God, please help me with this, or please, I'll do whatever it takes. I just would love to hear their voice one more time, that kind of a thing. Depression, that's the sadness of grief coming out. That's that stage. This is more often where tears kind of come in, maybe feelings of loneliness, a sense of being overwhelmed, even on a physiological side, having trouble sleeping or having issues with appetite, that kind of a thing. And the last stage is acceptance. That's where we kind of start to move forward, where grief isn't sort of the only feeling. It's where we're kind of able to get back to sort of the routine of life, a normalcy in life. And it doesn't mean that we don't miss the person. It doesn't mean that, there isn't pain in that loss, or feelings of kind of regret at that loss. But it's a point where we identify that we're maybe starting to heal. The wound is starting to heal up. It's starting to, scab over, scar over. And we can maybe start enjoying things again, and we can maybe just live with that loss in a new and different way. And just because these are called stages, that doesn't mean that they go in order. It doesn't mean that when we go through a stage, we're done with that stage. Just as an example, from my own experience, my grief reaction, I tend to go into like sort of denial, into that shock factor, and that kind of gets me through sort of the initial period of mourning. But it really kind of the actual sort of the rest of the stages of grief, right through from anger into bargaining into depression, all three of those kind of most of the time will hit me all at once, usually in like half an hour spurts where I'm just kind of like, it just kind of hits me like a brick wall, and all of a sudden everything kind of hurts, and I just kind of crumple, and often I'll dissolve into kind of a puddle of tears, because I'm a crier. It's what I do. But sometimes even there's yelling, or these prayers to God of like, why, or like, please, or how am I supposed to deal with this? It's just it's an overwhelming sense of emotion. So for me, I don't really go through stages. I go through kind of an initial shock, and then everything kind of hits me all at once. And yeah, and then acceptance can also be a rough one, because it doesn't happen all at once, right? I still carry the scars from my grief, and sometimes I have moments where I maybe think of someone that I've lost, or in this pandemic, there's been times where it's like, oh, we're coming up on something that normally this is what we would do, and we're not going to do that. And sometimes that pain will just kind of hit me, and the wound that had kind of scarred over kind of opens a little bit, and I feel that pain again. And particularly when it's the loss of someone that I love, if I know that I'm going into acceptance, when even if I think of them and the scar kind of opens, and there's still those kind of pangs of pain and that hurt, and how much I miss them, I can still think of them with love, and I can think of how much I love them, as opposed to maybe how much it hurts or how much I miss them. It's not, more love is kind of the primary feeling, as opposed to some of those more negative feelings. So how can we care for ourselves when we're in the midst of grief? Well, getting through grief takes time, and it takes patience. It's a process. We need to allow ourselves the liberty to feel what we're feeling. And talking to others can help, especially when we're trying to name our feelings and maybe process them. Catharsis is also important too. Finding ways to cry or to let out our anxieties, to let out our pain, our anger, or maybe our resentment. And being open to stillness and quiet can be a way of doing that, kind of allowing ourselves time to breathe. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we're not isolating ourselves, right? We need to spend time with other people, and we need to do things that bring us joy, because it's through those experiences of joy that we'll be able to kind of come through to the other side of grief. Physiologically, when we're grieving, doing basic self-care stuff kind of is the way to go. Making sure that we're eating well, that we're exercising, that we're drinking water, that we're doing our best to sleep and to have a sleep routine and to maintain our sleep routine, keeping up with basic hygiene and getting fresh air. Those little things go a long way, especially when maybe everything else maybe feels a little bit overwhelming. Prayer is also really helpful, especially in times where we feel angry, and particularly where maybe we feel angry at God. One of the best pieces of advice I ever have heard about the grieving process, and particularly when there's anger and when it's directed at God, the advice came from a priest colleague of mine who said, if you need to be angry at God, be angry. Express your anger in prayer and tell God how you're feeling. God can handle it. Like, don't worry about hurting God's feelings. God will be fine. Just be angry and show your anger to God. Be honest with God, because when you're able to kind of get all of that anger out of your system, God will still be there to comfort and to love and to support. So be angry, just don't turn your back, because God will still be there. And if you are still open to God at the end of this, God will be a comforting and loving presence. And, if after some time your grief kind of isn't getting better, you're not feeling better, after particularly a prolonged period of time, or maybe your grief starts interfering with day-to-day life and sort of your ability to live and to work and to keep up with things, talking to a doctor or to a therapist or both is a great choice. Sometimes we just need a little bit of help, and getting help through your grief is important. We've all gone through this. We're not an island. We can do this, and it helps if we do it together and if we lean on each other and help each other. So especially in this year where there's been so much loss already, and where we're continuing to experience losses, Christmas and New Year's are right around the corner, and they're not going to be the same. Our traditions are going to have to change this year. Our habits, particularly around these holidays, are changing this year and are changed. So let's just allow ourselves to grieve what we need to grieve. Let's give ourselves and each other that space, so that together we can make it through to the other side of our grief and the other side of this pandemic. Stay safe, everyone. We're praying for you. We're sending you all our love, particularly in this Christmas season and this New Year season. God be with you today and always. We'll see you in term 2.